Lecture 3, Liberalism.
Ladies and gentlemen, in this lecture I'm going to talk about liberalism. In the previous lecture I said something by way of introduction to liberalism, by way of discussing a conflict at the dinner table, the way in which different people with different views about welfare turned out to be offering different variants of the liberal tradition. And indeed we explored this by way of saying something about liberalism and its history. What I'm going to do in this lecture is rather different. What I'm going to do is to talk about liberalism in terms of its ideals and in terms of programs. Ideals here will refer again to values, to people's visions of what a good society should be like. Programs, much more to theories about how existing society works and what kind of social arrangements would actually serve to realize the ideals. I'll also say a bit about some of the disagreements that take place within liberalism. First then, properly speaking, liberalism and its ideals. Liberals will typically emphasize freedom and individual freedom, but they may place emphasis on freedoms of different kinds. For example, for some liberals, the key thing is the freedom of religion and freedom of opinion. The freedom to worship as you will rather than in a way that are imposed on you. The freedom to hold the particular views that you want about things and have the particular taste that you have. For some other people, the key freedoms are freedom of people from coercion and freedom of their property from invasion by others, and they also will typically stress the right to acquire property as being a key freedom. The third sort of approach is one which stresses, to a much greater degree, freedom of choice. For example, freedom of choice of your occupation, that you're not condemned to following a particular occupation because that's what your parents did and so on. But also, there's a notion of freedom in the sense of freedom to purchase things. I mean, from this point of view, the biggest Safeway supermarket you could imagine would be an exemplification of freedom. I mean, choices between more varieties of baked beans than you could ever imagine, or ketchup or whatever. These are one way in which people may emphasize freedom. Such freedoms and different interpretations of freedom are typically seen as what people might refer to as moral rights. By this they mean things that are prior to and independent of government decisions, and they may contrast here moral rights with what may be called positive rights, namely the rights that we have under current custom or legislation. That's to say, moral rights are rights that liberals feel that people should enjoy. Positive rights are the freedoms that, as a matter of fact, people do enjoy under whatever is current legislation, although liberals will very often say what we want is for legislation to be reshaped along the lines of our ideas about what moral rights should be. But what's typical from a liberal perspective is that when they're talking about rights, liberals mean rights that people should possess as moral rights, things that people are entitled to whether or not it's currently recognized in legislation. One or two comments about terminology may be helpful here. What about natural rights? I think natural rights are best understood as one particular theory of moral rights. I mean, namely, if people talk about natural rights, they normally mean that people have got rights. Why? Well, because of some aspect of perhaps a shared human nature. There may be other approaches, though, to the understanding of moral rights, and so natural rights is one of these. What about human rights? We often have that referred to. Well, that, I think, is a little bit ambiguous. Sometimes people may be referring to moral rights. Sometimes they have in mind something that's in some ways a bit closer to positive rights. That's to say, in some cases when people talk about human rights, what they mean are things that depend on either governmental or intergovernmental agreements. In other cases, they may say, well, whatever the governments have agreed, people have as human rights, certain rights of a more general kind, and they're talking about them as moral rights. Some liberals, it also should be said, notably those influenced by utilitarianism, the ideas that I was discussing last time in connection with John Stuart Mill, they don't use the terminology of rights, but often they offer other paths and arguments to much the same sort of ideas, much as John Stuart Mill developed ideas about in effect, what other people would refer to as individual rights, but arguing to this conclusion by appealing to utilitarian considerations. There's also, I should say, much room within liberalism for disputes about the scope and character of rights, and in many ways, indeed, the material that I was talking about last time in terms of the disagreements about welfare that might come about over a dinner table involves people taking up different strands of liberalism and arguing about what the proper scope and character of rights is. One other thing which is highly characteristic of liberalism is its view about government. For liberals, government should be fundamentally by consent. Government exists, from a liberal perspective, for the sake of its citizens, and its proper role is to safeguard their rights. Government is limited in its scope by what people will consent to. So just because you're dependent on the consent of other people in terms of what government will do, if people won't consent to things, then government will be limited. But it's also limited in terms of how it proceeds by individuals' rights. By and large, from a liberal perspective, rights that individuals have are, in a sense, barriers to government doing things that otherwise people would like them to do. They have to respect people's rights. So much, very briefly, in terms of ideals. What about programs? How, from a liberal perspective, does society work? Well, I think one might say, although liberals quite often don't put it like this, that liberals tend to believe that if people's rights are safeguarded, human interaction will then generate well-being. How's this going to take place? Well, in part, it's going to be by way of transactions in the marketplace, which they welcome because they're voluntary, and also because if people are transacting, both will typically feel that they're going to be better off after the transaction than they were before. The storekeeper prefers your money to the goods, you prefer the goods to the money, and so on. Recall in this context also the material about Adam Smith that I was talking about last time, concerning his account of the self-coordinating character of economic activity in a marketplace, are being guided by self-interest and prices into those actions and ways of deploying our goods and so on that fit in with other people's plans. Over and above this, liberals, though, will typically stress mutual aid and charity. Liberals typically welcome people getting together voluntarily to assist themselves and also to assist other people. Liberals also of different stripes will say there is room for governmental action, although what the proper scope of this is contentious amongst liberals in ways that I'll discuss shortly. I'd also say that if you're talking about programs, liberals typically hold some quite distinctive ideas about knowledge. First of all, individuals. And here, when liberals talk about individuals, they have non-dependent adults in mind. Individuals are typically taken as the best judges of their own interests. Consider in this context a holiday season. Someone, perhaps even someone who knows you and loves you, has given you a gift. If your experience is anything like mine, you look at this with a kind of mixture of horror and foreboding. What kind of thing have they got you? A tie, a book? Do they really know what you want? Well, in general, liberals want to say each individual is probably the best judge of what is in their own interests, of what their own concerns are, and so society works best to the degree to which people can get on and make decisions for themselves. Clearly, at the very beginning of our lives, when we're very small, then we're going to be dependent on others. We stand in need of paternalism. Typically also when we get very old, we may as well. But in the middle, liberals say individuals are by and large the people who know best what's good for them, and they should be able to get on and make decisions for themselves. On the theme of knowledge, liberals also, I think, typically take knowledge, including tacit knowledge, skills or know-how and so on, as socially distributed. It's to be found right across society. You might recall from the second lecture the ideas that I referred to in Friedrich Hayek's work about markets and the way in which they can enable us to make use of such tacit knowledge, knowledge which can't be centralized. Liberals also reject one idea that goes back really quite a way within political thought, right back to Plato, the argument that those who have knowledge should rule. Rather, the liberal view is more typically that if people need experts, they can hire them. One might say, and I don't want to point fingers in any particular direction, that from a liberal perspective, a good president, say, may not need to know very much. One may feel reassured about that from a liberal perspective. But the key thing is he or she just needs to know how to hire good people. And so from that perspective, what's typical is not